Welcome to the Children's Tradition Podcast, where we introduce families to the poetic life.
Hello, my name is Amanda Foss, and I am here with my husband, Patrick Foss.
That's right.
And we are coming on today to do a video about a topic that I know Patrick has just been itching to talk about, scary stories. So I kind of threw this idea at him and was like, hey, let's just hop on a video and talk about this topic, because I get questions all the time that are something of the nature of, why am I reading fairy tales with scary witches and children, or Hans Christian Andersen with stories where little girls die at the end, or these tragic tales? Or why are we reading tales from Shakespeare that has Shakespearean tragedies, or these sad stories that Romeo and Juliet, suicide, and yet we're saying, no, you should read this to your child. Let's start reading this in the school years, or even earlier, maybe in the nursery. And so with that kind of in mind, of just the fact that this is a common question we get, I thought it would be fun for us to have a conversation, because you are someone who actually really enjoys scary stories as an adult. So I think that'll inform how we have this conversation.
Well, and it is true. We literally just had a conversation where she said, let's hop on and have this conversation, which I'm really excited to do. And it is true. I actually grew up. So part of really just my sort of, I guess, story formation, as I've mentioned before, those who have watched our content, and that is through a lot of film. Particularly, I grew up with like the Universal monsters, like the old legendary Universal monsters. So, of course, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, the Invisible Man. And so that was definitely a part of my childhood, those type of stories.
Admittedly, like middle school, high school childhood. So we're going to talk about even broader into like the younger
right.
years. We're not necessarily going to advocate like show Dracula to your
and so, but I'm just saying the idea of horror stories was definitely something I engaged with. And I would say there was even then a period of my life, particularly right out of high school, that I was sort of on the side of, you can't engage with that at all, right? Sure. That there's actually no type of connection, no type of participation, no type of any type of, whether it's observation, whatever it may be, with the story that fundamentally
like
would
be
exactly any type of depiction. And if you're just kind of casual, whatever it was, I had the mindset for a certain period of time that you actually had to abstain from it.
Well, and there's a somewhat infamous story in his family, because this was associated with about the time that he started following Christ. So he grabbed a giant trash bag, put all his movies in it, and let me tell you, this guy had a collection, put most of his movies in it and threw it away, which his family just didn't even know what to do with that. So that's kind of funny. But
that is true. So what I used to do was, I was an avid collector of physical media at that time, particularly of DVDs, and my dad would give me lunch money every week. I'd get about $20, and instead of using that for actual lunch and for actual food, I then used that to go buy a movie. Best Buy was like my second home. I really actually ended up knowing all the sales clerks there and the managers there, just because I was there all the time, and I would go buy a movie. And I sort of had an Acts 19 sort of approach. For example, when the people of Ephesus, they're saved, they get rid of all of their books on sorcery and magic.
Admittedly, those were witchcraft.
Yes, right. And so some of my films, like anything that's rated R and it's not a Christian film, I was like, it must be discarded. You can't keep
Burn
it. It's polluted, right? It's possessed, and so it has to go. So yeah, now there is a different approach, I would say.
Yeah, throwback to those nostalgic days when you could go to Blockbuster Video. But so to get to our question, though, I was thinking as we would start, because you kind of have different angles of, like, each type of story is going to have a different aspect of why we would encourage this story to be read even in childhood. So like, I think we have a couple categories we could address, like fairy tales, myths probably would be a part of that. I have one quote I want to read from this, so I'm keeping it here. So you have fairy tales and myths, then we have like martyr stories, right, where people are obviously killed. You know, we read the story of lives of the saints or martyrs every day, and some people see that as kind of dark and morbid that we do that. And then what was the third category that, and then like I said, Shakespeare, which has cautionary tales that would, so why don't we start with Shakespeare in terms of, I know you're reading Tales from Shakespeare right now to your class, you're in our tutorial group. I've been reading beautiful stories from Shakespeare and Tales from Shakespeare to our children on repeat for 4 years. So that's just something we've really immersed our family in. But what would you say to someone who is concerned about the idea of introducing a story that has death, tragedy, something like that, to a younger child, we'll say the nursery. So first grade, right, in the curriculum, first grade, we say, hey, start reading beautiful stories from Shakespeare. And that could be an age where people are like, that's a little, it makes me nervous.
Well, I mean, I think the reality of any story of living in a fallen world is that death is the thing that we all deal with. Particularly within a modern lens, the idea of death is actually very foreign to us because death is so hidden from us. That's why COVID was so impactful, because it made the reality of death present again. And when people understand death as a more frequent thing or a more present thing that's very near and approximate, then stories, our understanding of eternality, immortality, all of that just becomes more prevalent. And particularly those who are part of the Christian tradition, the scriptures talk about death, right? Right at the beginning, in Genesis 3. In fact, the warning of death is given in Genesis 2. And so the scriptures constantly are talking about preparing yourself, right? Preparing for the final judgment to come. So death is always that sense of reality that is always lurking near us. So it's not something we should avoid.
Sure. Well, and even, okay, so I think maybe the concern people would have would be like, oh, well, a 7-year-old is so young, why can't we just keep them in a state of innocence? But to your point, the thing that comes to my mind when I hear these questions is that in some sense, it really is the privilege of modernity that we could even think we could keep a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old from the concept of death. If you are going to church and hearing the scriptures read aloud, I know like if you're in a liturgical tradition, usually they will read through the Bible throughout the year. You are constantly going to be confronted with, at a minimum, Christ's death, which was quite gruesome, quite torturous. But beyond that, the lives of all the people in scripture. If you start in Genesis, you get like 3 chapters in before, the fall, which is tragic. And then just, 2 chapters later, the flooding of the entire world where everybody gets killed except for one family. Like these are, and so I think what's interesting about it is I've thought a lot about, well, we should look to the church as our guide for what is proper and healthy to expose our children to. So if the church thinks that our children should be in church with us, that should be having our children a part of the service, and then in that service, we're going to read these stories of these biblical stories. We're going to read these stories from, like I said, martyrs or Christian heroes from the past who lived and died for Christ, is a guideline of, okay, well then we certainly can't just remove these topics from the equation at all. Now, obviously, secondarily, you have, well, how in depth are we going to go? I think that's a beautiful thing about scripture is it can imply something without getting so into the weeds of it, about it, so detailed that it's filling your mind with graphic evil images. But again, even then, it's not going to shy away from the topics, which I think is very much connected to what Charlotte Mason talks about with children, right? That children, they will only take in what they're ready for, especially when it comes to literature. So I think there's very different standards for what types of film, for example, or images, even paintings, right? If there was like a horror type image, I would not go presenting that to a young child. I think the power of images is so intense that we really have to avoid that for the younger years.
Same thing with film.
Yeah. But with things like literature, what's so great about reading a fairy tale that might include things like, yes, this evil stepmother has to wear irons on her feet and dance until she dies, which is like, horrifying. Again, like as an adult, you're like, oh my gosh, like this is horrible. But a child only takes in what they can comprehend in their imagination based off of their own experience. So what you as an adult hear and imagine in your mind when you read that is not the same thing that your 4, 5, 6-year-old is going to imagine. When they're reading these fairy tales, they're basically just getting the takeaway of, well, that was the bad guy and she died and it was bad for her. And that was the good guy and look, oh, they lived happily ever after, right? Children's ability to take things in is going to be limited by the scope of their experience. And this is actually a really positive thing because then we can begin giving them these stories at a younger age, but we're doing so in a way that we don't have to be so fearful that we're going to be introducing ideas that are so, that would be detrimental to their development.
Yeah, their ability to comprehend, right? Their ability to process, particularly when we talk about the lives of the saints. It's not only looking how they lived lives well, that they were holy and that they were faithful into the end, but it's that they died well, right? And some of those deaths are a little bit more morbid and in terms of a descriptive sense, really hard to swallow and to take in. But I don't think we avoid that. I think there's what we do and what we need to be exercise prudence with our children is how deep we go with that. Sure. I don't think we avoid the book of Judges.
Sure.
I don't think we ignore that. I don't think we avoid the books that are monarchical, right? Dealing with, right, 1st, 2nd Samuel, right? I think of like Samuel cutting up Hagag. I mean, that's pretty graphic in 1st Samuel 15, right? Yeah. And so I don't think we don't read them, but I think we read them carefully. Right? I think we read them very wisely because there's only so much that they can process and there's only so much that they can take in. But I don't think we avoid them because when we understand the scope and the shape of the world, yes, we're very accustomed, especially when we're talking about fairy tales and we're talking about these different stories. We all get, and we're all on the same team about that beauty. Like as Dostoevsky said, beauty will save the world, right? Because beauty has that power to motivate. But don't forget, not only does beauty have the power, tragedy also has a power to motivate us, where it can create a level of fear, where it's that cautionary, it's proverbial, right? It warns us of what could happen. It also can create a sense of pity, right? That then creates in us this very careful sense of discernment and deliberation of how we act that is morally transformative on the imaginative level. And so I think at the same time, we have to think of these stories that, yes, beauty has its place. We want beauty, of course. We're not saying that we're saying the eradication of beauty. But the reason why these sort of what we would say scarier stories, or stories, especially as the Brothers Grimm, where they just sort of end with the conclusion, that's the way of the world, they're telling us something that is proverbially true. That is tragic that is tragic in terms of its nature, but nevertheless, it is still informing us how we ought to live or what we ought to avoid.
Well, and I think a key in this is why we don't analyze stories, right? If you're analyzing and drawing your child's attention to the details of that graphic thing, that could then cement it in their mind in a different way. Whereas when you just let it be more of that imaginative background reading kind of just washing over them, and then, you could have them narrate, they'll tell you what they heard, and then you just move on. It's much more poetic in the sense of it's forming that heart. It's forming that loving attention. Their attention will be directed to what they love and know within that story. And children need stories where there is good and there is bad. They need that strong moral framework. And we want them to see that pattern of reality. And death is a part of the pattern of reality. Tragedy is a part of the pattern of reality, obviously in this world. Not forever, not in paradise, but for now, the tragedy and death are very much a part of this world. I think another angle we have to consider with this is that the reason we read anything we read in the children's tradition is that we are reading it to fill in that cultural soil. Okay, I'm going to read this quote from the Canadian literary critic Northrop Frye, who said, "If we don't know the Bible and the central stories of Greek and Roman literature, we can still read books and see plays, but our knowledge of literature can't grow, just as our knowledge of mathematics can't grow if we don't learn the multiplication table." There are stories, like we're always talking about in TCT, this cultural soil, the essential stories, that if you don't know these stories, you will never be able to have a deep relationship with the rest of literature. So fairy tales are in that. Shakespeare is definitely in that. She doesn't mention Shakespeare here, but I think there's a strong argument to be made that Shakespeare comes close to the Bible and the Greek myths in terms of its formation of the English language, of the different expressions that we have in I mean, you can't read a novel of the past couple hundred years and not have at least one reference that is directly because of Shakespeare, or not, I shouldn't say directly, because it could be indirectly, right? Directly or indirectly, Shakespeare's hands are on it because he so profoundly shaped the Western world and the English-speaking world as far as how we talk and what we talk. So with all of that, though, there's an idea that you could wait to encounter these stories, but because they are so far removed from modern culture, we have to start early in trying to restock those cultural soil to hopefully give them enough of a boost so that when they come to high school and are actually reading Shakespeare's plays for themselves, that they will have enough familiarity with the stories that they won't get just completely bogged down in the details of the poetry, right? And I mean, we're coming at this from every angle. We read tons of poetry in TCT. We obviously are reading the tales from Shakespeare, beautiful stories from Shakespeare. So we're trying to prepare them so that when they encounter this, this par excellence of literature, Shakespeare in adolescence, I think the first play we do is Comedy of Errors, which we do in 6th grade, but if we're going to encounter those things, we want them prepared. And that means that, yes, we're going to start early, just giving them the stories. And again, they're just going to take in what they can handle. So the 7-year-old is not going to come away with knowing every detail of the plot, right? They're going to grab this little thing here and this little thing there and basically just come away with a few things that they enjoyed about it. But then later, as you're going about your weeks as the weeks and months go on, you will find that your child will notice references to Shakespeare stories all over the place. Like, it is just a thing that, because Shakespeare is so much a part of our world, even though on the one hand we are removed from it in modernity, so many people in modernity would not even be capable of reading Shakespeare right now, and yet it's truly inescapable. I mean, whether that's in film, other types of media, art, there's gonna be references. And so we're hopefully giving them that exposure starting early enough and for long enough so that they're not encountering Shakespeare later, like in translation, like, oh, I don't really understand it. There's always this gap between me and Shakespeare. But so that when they come to Shakespeare, the real Shakespeare, they're like, yes, here he is, my friend. I knew you all along.
Well, the form of the world that we live in is complex. Human nature is complex. So we want to show them the variety of that. I don't think we want to be selective here of how we engage the world. We want to demonstrate, and we want to bring students into that world. That's obviously why we would say you have to start with the poetic mode, and in terms of beginning with analyzation of why that hinders them and being able to enter and to engage into the world, because you lose the nature, right, of what that world is. You lose the essence of that world because everything's just fragmented into bullet points and all these pieces here that you have really nothing to actually ground yourself in. And so we want to show them the different doors, right, to come through, and the complexities of that. And I think particularly on the realm of the more what we would say scary or maybe the horror genre, what we're highlighting here is, and I think particularly we have to, of course, in anything we're doing with parents, we have to exercise wisdom and discernment pertaining to our children. For example, if I was giving a fairy tale type of story, and there's a part of that story of where they're in the dark enchanted forest. And if my children saw that, they recognize it and they're saying, hey, that's interesting, but they don't want to stay there. Right? There's a sense of, hey, we're coming through, we're passing it along, it's here, it exists, it is real, but we don't want to stay here. That we can work with. The difference, though, would be if you have a student or a child who says, I really like the dark forest, this is my home. And I actually feel more of a relatability and a comfortability with the dark enchanted forest. That's where then we have a problem, because now they're drawn to the dark side of enchantment rather than the light side of enchantment.
Which, as you're saying that, I'm just theorizing here, but as you're saying that, I'm thinking, I wonder if that is only the kind of thing that would happen to either a child who has had serious trauma, that could happen, or more likely to, and maybe more likely in the type of families who are listening to this podcast, it would happen to someone who didn't encounter scary stories, and then their first encounter with those stories is in adolescence, when on an embodiment level, the student, the young man or young woman is feeling awkward. They're feeling this gap between them and the world of like, I'm uncomfortable. I feel like I look weird.
There's an unhealthy curiosity, I think, that can come with that.
Yes, there's totally that. But I'm even thinking beyond that of like, in their discomfort and the feeling of I feel like a weirdo, that they would then could be drawn to like identifying with the weirdo, with the freak, with the mutated. Yeah, with the mutated,
with
right?
the deformed.
Like, we've had a lot of conversations about a Nightmare Before Christmas, why like to us, like that's insidious, because the problem with that is not merely that it's a scary story. The problem with that is it's saying, oh, look at all these freakish, ghoulish creatures. Oh, and spoiler alert, they're the good guys. It's actually, look, they're just misunderstood, right? Isn't that like the common thing in modernity? Oh, look at this guy who self-evidently is evil in every way, but he's just misunderstood.
So the mutated, deformed is actually a good thing.
Yes, they make it a good thing. And so, again, I think that's why you often see, like if you go to Disneyland, right? And we do, because we live in Southern California. But if you go there, you will often see a lot of teenagers who are drawn to that aesthetic. And I think it has a lot to do on a psychological, emotional, spiritual level with the fact that at that very age where they are most uncomfortable and feeling like the weirdo and the outsider themselves, they're drawn to it. And that's just a theory.
Well,
right?
and any world you're drawn to, whatever has your imagination, your affections, that worldview, that presentation, it has a wardrobe. It has a uniform, right? And so that sense of affection then is manifested, it's presented, right, in the very way that they present themselves, right? Yeah. So you see that with anything, but yeah, we have to exercise, of course, care with anything, and particularly, like I said, somebody who loved that the more horror genre, right, in terms, I guess you could film. The reason why I came back to it, right, was in the sense that, okay, is there a way to actually engage with these stories that is appropriate? Is there a way to engage with these stories that is saying something true about the world? I think one of the things what we don't want to do, there's a distinction of depiction and a distinction of celebration. Right, you can go to certain stories, especially more you see this in sort of modern, I guess you could say, horror depictions of film and storytelling, where it's the celebration of the evil itself. Yeah. It's the celebration and the endorsement of darkness itself, rather than, no, darkness does exist, but the light overcomes it. The light is more powerful. That's John 1, right? John 1:5, right? That the darkness cannot comprehend it. The light always overcomes the dark. And so in those stories, right, it's one thing we want to look at. Is evil being shown here and being displayed here as something that wins in the end and something that we should love and embrace and we should stay in? Or is evil something that is a reality, it's depicting it, yet at the end of the day, too, we recognize it is defeated like death is defeated as well.
Yeah, and that's more of a principle I know we would just affirm for you all. He's talking at that point, when we're talking about watching a horror film, we're meaning adults or, like 16, 17 on.
Very much so.
We're not talking about the children, but those ideas flow together. So. The ideas flow together where there's a principle here of good is good and bad is bad. And that principle starts in childhood with something like a
And I can tell you, in terms of actually horror films itself, the reason why I would watch a horror film over a comedy, it makes that distinction so well, good and evil, where it shows, right, that unevenness, right, so the evil recognizes, right, the upside downness, where the good represents the sense where you're leveled and you're actually balanced. And good stories show the dividing line between living in a world where I'm looking at it rightly and living in a world where I'm looking at things from an upside down, concorked, or twisted perspective. And good stories show we need to actually bring the upside down world and we may need to make it level again. Yeah. And that really is the key thing with story, where if I take like a certain comedy, they actually blur the line of good and evil because they make a mockery of it.
Well, I think like women at church wouldn't necessarily bat an eyelash about getting together to watch like a romantic comedy. And yet it's probably going to show some type of immorality. It's going to, usually the stories are about people before marriage.
That's most sitcoms. I think of Friends that were so popular, right? It manifests this type of reality of just sort of casual immorality. Yeah, is what it does.
And so I think that's like a good like modern radar test for us is like, am I more disturbed at the idea of humor that is, and I think, okay, this is going to trickle. We're just hitting on everything today. This is going to trickle back down to childhood too, in the sense of the people who are okay, and when I'm saying the people, I'm not pointing the finger. This was me 10 years ago. So Patrick will tell you, this is a confession. But what it is we when I was watching those things, or anyone who struggles with it, there's a sense in which we got our sense of like our conscience was stripped down on the level of like indiscreet humor, filthy jokes, and that sort of thing was trivialized. Right?
It was numb. We became numb to it.
You become numb to it because that is, even in Christian circles, much more socially acceptable to take in context.
It's what Jerry Bridges talks about in his book, Respectable Sins. Right.
Whereas conversely, with a child, I think this starts with the type of home that does indiscreet, poor humor about things like bathroom jokes and degradation of the body and bathroom humor and things like that, where there's things that are gross are meant to be representations of something like, yucky at best or evil at worst. It's made like light of, like, oh, you hit your brother, ha 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 ha, right? Like these are the kinds of things, like if it's funny, if we're making jokes at a young age, and really this really ties to Hilaire Belloc. He has, cautionary tales for children, or the children's book of, the Bad Children's Book of Beasts. But these are cautionary stories, all of them, where it basically like always ends with like, and the child's got its head eaten off by a lion, or like something very intense. But his whole theme is don't act like an animal, act like a person, right? And so with cautionary tales, a lot of the time it's this vision of, hey, you don't need to act like an animal. You should act like a human. And human beings have dignity, have worth, have value. And now let's watch this cautionary tale, or read this cautionary tale of how this person acted below their dignity, or these people acted foolishly or whatever, and ultimately it's a stripping of their humanity. Like that's the real tragedy, right? Is like a stripping of humanity.
Yeah, and that's why we would call it a tragedy, right? Where, I mean, you could really boil it down. There's kind of two genres, right? There's comedy, which is ascension, right? You're down below, right? That's divine comedy, right? You're down below, but then you ascend, right, to the idea of paradise, a heaven, of glory, or you're at a place that's actually good. It doesn't necessarily mean it's glory, but you're in a state that is civil. You could say balanced, it's virtuous, it's ordered, and then it's a descension, right? Where you see and that's the nature of tragedy. And when we're engaging with material that is on the tragedy level, there's going to be a heaviness to our soul. There's going to be a sense of weightiness, and there should be. There should be. We should feel that sense of almost burden. And so as we engage it, I think we shouldn't engage it lightly. We should engage it properly. And I also think we should engage it proportionately because it is heavy. So we do want to make sure that my whole diet of consumption should not just be the heavy.
Sure.
But nevertheless, when I do engage with tragedy, I should feel its heaviness. For example, when I read the minor prophets, which are filled with oracles and prophecies that are filled with judgment, you literally have the prophets saying this is a weighty prophecy because they themselves feel so when we feel tragedy, right, and we see it unfolding before us, we should feel that sense of, like I said, weightiness upon us as we're engaging with it, and a sense of grief and even mourning and sorrow as we see it. It would be uneven if we didn't.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the framing that comes into us is that we do not have a Rousseauian kind of concept that like children are in this garden of innocence that we need to protect. We believe, well, let me be clear, we do believe children need to be protected, but what we don't believe in that vision, right? That, oh, they're just innocent and then we come in and spoil them with this rottenness, right? The reality is a child comes into the world in a state of fallenness, right? And because of the fall, they will, earlier than you ever expect. I'm always surprised at how early children start asking questions like, well, mommy and daddy, are you gonna die? Or, like the weight of those type of questions hit them very young. I would say 3, 4, 5 years old at the latest, right? So they already are having these questions. And what we're trying to do is give them the stories that show them, yes, isn't this sad? There is death. But look, God has overcome death. Look, the martyrs, they're wearing a crown and glory right now. Or these stories where, yes, in this story, this character was the bad character, but look how it ended for them. Whereas look at this, Cinderella, who was gracious and always ran to receive grace really from above, really from her mother, is in the original fairy tale, that as she keeps returning for more grace, and even in her trials and tribulation, God was a comfort to her, and then ultimately brought her through a tragedy, and she's a princess at the end, right? And it gives them, the child, especially the young child, they will not identify with the villain. They will always identify with the good guy because that's who they want to be. Every child is born wanting to be the princess, wanting to be the knight, wanting to be the hero. And so when they read a story that is a cautionary tale or has something tragic in it, I've never once seen a child or heard from any friend to have a child who's like, oh yeah, they just really love the witches. Like that's who they wish they could be. Now I think that can happen on a modern level with like, modern concepts of those things because they're made fuzzy and cute and fun. Again, we're talking about like the books on the 1,000 Good Books list. We are not meaning just any story about witches or any story
time-tested stories.
Yeah, we're talking about the time-tested ones. That again, it just comes back to cultures would have had in the air that, it wasn't in a book. They were just hearing these stories.
And again, it comes back to, as we were talking about the saints earlier, is that not only did they live well, they died well, and that's what we want for our children, right? We want them to live well, but we also want our children to know they're going to die, and we want them to die well. Now, am I going to talk about death on such a descriptive, specific level with certain age of our children? No, that happens sequentially more over time. But do I want to avoid that topic entirely? No.
Well, again, keep it poetic, not analytical. If you're just introducing the concepts of death within stories, right? So it's a plot point within a story. That is poetic versus being like, so do you know people die?
Well, that just feels incredibly morbid and abstract.
Yeah, right? Like we're not talking about doing that. Like
showing them unsolved mysteries.
Right? You're not trying to draw them towards you want to tell the whole story, right? And the whole story for Christians is always that death, where is your victory? Grave, where is your, or was it death, where is your sting? Yeah, death, where is your victory? Grave, where is your sting? That is the Christian message, and that is how we approach all stories. And the best stories, they maintain that. And ultimately, to your point, give children an opportunity to start intuitively being formed on that pre-rational, emotional level to be, I want to be with the good. I want to stand for the good, and I want to be against the bad and the evil.
Well, and again, when we're talking about the moral imagination and trying to reach our children at the level of the imagination, then really it's two types of stories you're going to give them. It's beauty and tragedy. That's really at the core, and that's what time-tested stories get, that reality and that nature accurately and faithfully. And those two forms, right, beauty and tragedy, those actually do incite and provoke change. And there's going to be some people, it's the beauty side, right? And then there's going to be some people like Pinocchio who just don't get it. And it's the level of the tragedy, again and again and again, where he finally says, I confess, I repent, and I need to turn from my ways, right? Where he's at the graveside of the fairy, and he finally gets it, right? Unfortunately, that tends to be me. I tend to be on the side of more of the tragedy, right? Where it's like, can I finally get it? And now we can finally go. Then there's people where it's just the beauty of beholding something so transcendent and so beautiful, where it's like, yep, I want that. And that's the ultimate thing. We want the tragedy to be the cautionary thing. Avoid, don't do, learn from. And so then they have we would say almost like this sight of that it's illuminated for them so that the beautiful becomes even more clear and more tangible for them to grab.
Yes, to your point, it's a way of seeing the world. That's what we're giving children with these stories. We're giving them a way of seeing the world. And it does not come by, again, pointing it out. Oh, did you see that's the bad guy? Did you see that's... You don't have to tell kids. No child has to, upon reading Pinocchio, is like, oh, that was just great that Pinocchio kept failing his father. And so you're like...
No, nobody's going to walk away in Pinocchio thinking the fox and the cat, those were noble, good
like, that's who I want
individuals.
To be like.
Yeah, cunning and insidious, yeah.
Good stories will not mix that up for your kids. So... I think that's everything, unless I've missed any aspects that you want.
No, I guess would there be any types of stories that you would recommend, especially as we're entering into the fall, any good stories that you would recommend parents read?
Oh, man. Okay.
I know I'm putting you on the spot here.
You are, that's fine. I mean, this whole thing's been on the spot.
This whole thing was on the spot.
I mean, I will say the Grimm's fairy tales, even though we always encourage you to read them year round, if you're like, grab this story and gather round, then that is, I mean, you can't really get better than that. Man, I'm gonna have to think longer about that. Maybe I'll think about it, and what I might do is maybe put like a themed book list in the tool shed. I think that would be the best way to go. Which, speaking of which, before we end, if you are not in the tool shed, we would invite you to join us. That is where families using the children's tradition come to gather to talk about poetic knowledge. We even have families who aren't using the curriculum yet, but are just interested in learning more about this way of education as a life, right? Poetic experience is not a phase. It is not a box you check. It is truly
you don't graduate from it.
You do not graduate from it. It is a way of life for the whole family as we create cultures, family cultures, in which Christ is the center of it all, and we are living a life that leads us from wonder to worship. So thank you for listening to this podcast. Hope it's been helpful to you, and we'll see you next time.
Goodbye.